So you see, Claudine concluded, we are just the next generation in a proud tradition that began back when you were in first grade. Chapter 3. Indonesia. Lessons for an EHM. In addition to learning about my new career, I also spent time reading books about Indonesia. I took her words to heart. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he was trying to reach Indonesia, known at the time as the Spice Islands. Throughout the colonial era, it was considered a treasure worth far more than the Americas. Java, with its rich fabrics, fabled spices, and opulent kingdoms, was both the crown jewel and the scene of violent clashes between Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and British adventurers. The Netherlands emerged triumphant in 1750, but even though the Dutch controlled Java, it took them more than 150 years to subdue the outer islands. When the Japanese invaded Indonesia during World War II, Dutch forces offered little resistance. As a result, Indonesians, especially the Javanese, suffered terribly. Following the Japanese surrender, a charismatic leader named Sukarno emerged to declare independence. 4 years of fighting finally ended on December 27, 1949, when the Netherlands lowered its flag and returned sovereignty to a people who had known nothing but struggle and domination for more than 3 centuries. Sukarno became the new republic's first president. Ruling Indonesia, however, proved to be a greater challenge than defeating the Dutch. Far from homogeneous, the archipelago of about 17,500 islands was a boiling pot of tribalism, divergent cultures, dozens of languages and dialects, and ethnic groups who nursed centuries-old animosities. Conflicts were frequent and brutal, and Sukarno clamped down. He suspended Parliament in 1960 and was named President for life in 1963. He formed close alliances with communist governments around the world in exchange for military equipment and training. He sent Russian-armed Indonesian troops into neighboring Malaysia in an attempt to spread communism throughout Southeast Asia and win the approval of the world's socialist leaders. Opposition built, and a coup was launched in 1965. Sukarno escaped assassination only through the quick wits of his mistress. Many of his top military officers and his closest associates were less lucky. The events were reminiscent of those in Iran in 1953. In the end, the Communist Party was held responsible, especially those factions aligned with China. In the army-initiated massacres that followed, an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people were killed. The head of the military, General Suharto, took over as president in 1968. By 1971, the United States' determination to seduce Indonesia away from communism was heightened because the outcome of the Vietnam War was looking very uncertain. President Nixon had begun a series of troop withdrawals in the summer of 1969, and U.S. strategy was taking on a more global perspective. The strategy focused on preventing a domino effect of one country after another falling under communist rule, and it focused on a couple of countries. Indonesia was the key. Maine's electrification project was part of a comprehensive plan to ensure American dominance in Southeast Asia. The premise of U.S. foreign policy was that Suharto would serve Washington in a manner similar to the Shah of Iran. The United States also hoped the nation would serve as a model for other countries in the region. Washington based part of its strategy on the assumption that gains made in Indonesia might have positive repercussions throughout the Islamic world, particularly in the explosive Middle East. And if that were not incentive enough, Indonesia had oil. No one was certain about the magnitude or quality of its reserves, but oil company seismologists were exuberant over the possibilities. As I pored over the books at the BPL, my excitement grew. I began to imagine the adventures ahead. In working for Maine, I would be trading the rugged Peace Corps lifestyle for a much more luxurious and glamorous one. My time with Claudine already represented the realization of one of my fantasies. It seemed too good to be true. I felt at least partially vindicated for serving the sentence at that all-boys prep school. Something else was also happening in my life. Anne and I were not getting along. I think she must have sensed that I was leading two lives. I justified it as the logical result of the resentment I felt toward her for forcing us to get married in the first place. Never mind that she had nurtured and supported me through the challenges of our Peace Corps assignment in Ecuador. I still saw her as a continuation of my pattern of giving in to my parents' whims. Of course, as I look back on it, I'm sure my relationship with Claudine was a major factor. I could not tell Anne about this, but she sensed it. In any case, we decided to move into separate apartments. One day in 1971, about a week before my scheduled departure for Indonesia, I arrived at Claudine's place to find the small dining room table set with an assortment of cheeses and breads, and there was a fine bottle of Beaujolais. She toasted me. "You've made it." She smiled, but somehow it seemed less than sincere. "You're now one of us." We chatted casually for half an hour or so. Then, as we were finishing off the wine, she gave me a look unlike any I had seen before. "Never admit to anyone about our meetings," she said in a stern voice. "I won't forgive you if you do, ever, and I'll deny I ever met you." She glared at me, perhaps the only time I felt threatened by her, and then gave a cold laugh. "Talking about us would make life dangerous for you." I was stunned. I felt terrible. But later, as I walked alone back to the Prudential Center, I had to admit to the cleverness of the scheme. The fact is that all our time together had been spent in her apartment. There was not a trace of evidence about our relationship, and no one at Maine was implicated in any way. There was also part of me that appreciated her honesty. She had not deceived me the way my parents had about Tilton and Middlebury. Chapter 4. Saving a Country from Communism. I had a romanticized vision of Indonesia, the country where I was to live for the next 3 months. Some of the books I read featured photographs of beautiful women in brightly colored sarongs, exotic Balinese dancers, shamans blowing fire, and warriors paddling long dugout canoes in emerald waters at the foot of smoking volcanoes. Particularly striking was a series on the magnificent black-sailed galleons of the infamous Boogie pirates, who still sailed the seas of the archipelago, and who had so terrorized early European sailors that they returned home to warn their children, "Behave yourselves, or the boogeymen will get you." Oh, how those pictures stirred my soul. The history and legends of that country represent a cornucopia of larger-than-life figures, wrathful gods, Komodo dragons, tribal sultans, and ancient tales that long before the birth of Christ had traveled across Asian mountains, through Persian deserts, and over the Mediterranean to embed themselves in the deepest realms of our collective psyche. The very names of its fabled islands, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, seduced the mind. Here was a land of mysticism, myth, and erotic beauty, an elusive treasure sought but never found by Columbus, a princess wooed yet never possessed by Spain, by Holland, by Portugal, by Japan, a fantasy and a dream. My expectations were high, and I suppose they mirrored those of the great explorers. Like Columbus, though, I should have known to temper my fantasies. Perhaps I could have guessed that the beacon shines on a destiny that is not always the one we envision. Indonesia offered treasures, but it was not the chest of panaceas I had come to expect. In fact, My first days in Indonesia's steamy capital, Jakarta, in the summer of 1971, were shocking. The beauty was certainly present. Gorgeous women sporting colorful sarongs, lush gardens ablaze with tropical flowers, exotic Balinese dancers, bicycle cabs with fanciful rainbow-colored scenes painted on the sides of the high seats, where passengers reclined in front of the pedaling drivers, Dutch colonial mansions and turreted mosques. But there was also an ugly, tragic side to the city. Lepers holding out bloodied stumps instead of hands. Young girls offering their bodies for a few coins. Once splendid Dutch canals turned into cesspools. Cardboard hovels where entire families lived along the trash-lined banks of black rivers. Blaring horns and choking fumes. The beautiful and the ugly, the elegant and the vulgar, the spiritual and the profane. This was Jakarta, where the enticing scent of cloves and orchid blossoms battled the miasma of open sewers for dominance. I had seen poverty before. Some of my New Hampshire classmates lived in cold-water tar-paper shacks and arrived at school wearing thin jackets and frayed tennis shoes on sub-zero winter days, their unwashed bodies reeking of old sweat and manure. I had lived in mud shacks with Andean peasants whose diet consisted almost entirely of dried corn and potatoes, and where it sometimes seemed that a newborn was as likely to die as to experience a birthday. I had seen poverty, but nothing to prepare me for Jakarta. Our team, of course, was quartered in the country's fanciest hotel, the Hotel Intercontinental Indonesia, owned by Pan American Airways, like the rest of the intercontinental chain scattered across the globe. It catered to the whims of wealthy foreigners, especially oil executives and their families. On the evening of our first day, our project manager, Charlie Illingworth, hosted a dinner for us in the elegant restaurant on the top floor. Charlie was a connoisseur of war. He devoted most of his free time to reading history books and historical novels about great military leaders and battles. He was the epitome of the pro-Vietnam War armchair soldier. As usual, this night he was wearing khaki slacks and a short-sleeved khaki shirt with military-style epaulets. After welcoming us, he lit up a cigar. "To the good life," he sighed, raising a glass of champagne. We joined him. "To the good life." Our glasses clinked. Cigar smoke swirling around him, Charlie glanced about the room. "We will be well pampered here," he said, nodding his head appreciatively. "The Indonesians will take very good care of us, as will the U.S. Embassy people, but let's not forget that we have a mission to accomplish." He looked down at a handful of note cards. "Yes, we're here to develop a master plan for the electrification of Java, the most populated land in the world. But that's just the tip of the iceberg." His expression turned serious. He reminded me of George C. Scott playing General Patton, one of Charlie's heroes. "We are here to accomplish nothing short of saving this country from the clutches of communism. As you know, Indonesia has a long and tragic history. Now, at a time when it is poised to launch itself into the 20th century, it is tested once again. Our responsibility is to make sure that Indonesia doesn't follow in the footsteps of its northern neighbors, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. An integrated electrical system is a key element. That, more than any other single factor, with the possible exception of oil, will assure that capitalism and democracy rule." "Speaking of oil," he said. He took another puff on his cigar and flipped past a couple of the note cards. "We all know how dependent our own country is on oil. Indonesia can be a powerful ally to us in that regard. So as you develop this master plan, please do everything you can to make sure that the oil industry and all the others that serve it, ports, pipelines, construction companies, get whatever they are likely to need in the way of electricity for the entire duration of this 25-year plan. He raised his eyes from his note cards and looked directly at me. Better to err on the high side than to underestimate. You don't want the blood of Indonesian children, or our own, on your hands. You don't want them to live under the hammer and sickle or the red flag of China. As I lay in my bed that night, high above the city, secure in the luxury of a first-class suite, an image of Claudine came to me. Her discourses on foreign debt haunted me. I tried to comfort myself by recalling lessons learned in my macroeconomics courses at business school. After all, I told myself, I am here to help Indonesia rise out of a medieval economy and take its place in the modern industrial world. The more you know about a country before you get there, the easier your job will be, Claudine had advised.